Hello, welcome to I Read This Book with Chris. With me, Chris. Today, we'll be discussing Armageddon 2419 by Philip Francis Nowlan. We'll discuss while drinking a raspberry bubbly. So, I'm sure if you couldn't tell, you probably could tell, this is not the original cover. So Buck Rogers, my dad read it to me when I was a kid. And so when I came across a copy, even though the copy was in bad shape, I picked it up. I mean, it was cheap. It might have been free. Definitely less than $1. I picked it up. The front and back cover fell off, but it's not missing any actual pages in there. So I just replaced the cover with some cardstock and taped it on. So it's completely usable as a book. We will put the artwork up here so you can see what it actually looked like. This is apparently the seminal Buck Rogers novel. Buck Rogers was originally in a couple of short stories in the 1920s that then got turned into the comic strip, which it was well known for. Buck Rogers in the 25th century. Out of that success came a bunch of novels, multiple TV shows, multiple movies, multiple books. The original series was 12 books, and then later on, other authors came in and added to the series in the 80s. But this, Armageddon 2419, is Buck Rogers, but is the first two short stories that were originally made, where Buck Rogers isn't even known as Buck Rogers, he's known as Anthony Rogers. So this actually has a copyright of 1962 because it was, this edition has been specially revised and updated for the modern reader by noted science fiction critic and Hugo Award winner Spider Robinson. Who or what is Buck Rogers or Anthony Rogers? Buck Rogers was a man from the 19 teens who went into a cave and was knocked out and preserved and woke up 500 years in the future, in the year 2419. He wakes up into a world very drastically different from the world that he knew, with all sorts of crazy things going on. The first couple of weeks that he's awake, he's just in the woods trying to survive, trying to figure out how he can survive, catching animals, just surviving out in nature. After a couple of weeks, he sees two people. He sees someone getting chased by a couple of other people. He decides to pick a side, helps the person who's being chased after they get knocked out, and fights off the other people, at which point he becomes part of her gang. The woman he helps out is Wilma. She's part of the Wyoming gang, and they are, America is inhabited by gangs of a couple hundred to 1,000 people, spread out across the whole continent, who are living in the woods under the rule of the Hans. The Hans basically are Chinese empire that had taken over the world after multiple world wars. China, who was then able to invade and take over America, over Europe. We later learn on Africa. The whole world's controlled by this Han. They are so technologically advanced that they don't ever have to leave their cities. Everything is produced. They transmogrify things. All their clothes and everything are produced by machine. And they basically just, have a nice, easy, protected life. While everyone who was not killed in their takeover now lives, in comparison, as wild animals or a guerrilla group, depending on who you'll ask, in the woods. Buck Rogers finds himself in the Wyoming gang because he helped out Wilma, who was getting chased by some outlaw gang who's just there to cause trouble, basically. The Hans go and do a raid on the Wyoming base, and Buck Rogers has an idea in order to take down the ship. So they're able to take down the ship that is attacking with their disintegrator rays. At which point, he then proves himself when more ships come to try to figure out what happened. And the boss of the gang basically says, all right, this is your gang now. You're the new boss. And hands over bossship of the Wyoming gang to Buck. He marries Wilma. The lady who he saves. And basically now they are in all-out war against the Hans, who have not only been ruling over them for 400 years, but also against another tribe, which they realize have been trading information about the gangs to the Hans in exchange for some fancy stuff. So after a raiding mission, they find that out, and they go and there's a whole military sequence where things go down and they attack the Hans. At which point, everything's going great, except Buck Rogers loses control of his airship that he's in, accidentally goes a couple hundred miles in the wrong direction, crashes or ejects himself safely from the ship, but is captured by the Hans. The second half of the novel describes Rogers in this Han city. He sees that they have the Hans, after getting themselves into such a superior technological state, have allowed themselves to deteriorate and become weak, soulless men. They don't have any respect for anyone in or outside of their gang. They're not physically strong because they don't need to be, because everything's done for them. Everything comes at the press of a button. And they don't have a good philosophy of life, basically. Not only that, but marriages don't really exist. There are marriages, but they are so temporary and can be broken off by either member for whatever reason, that there is no marriages, so to speak. Children, once they are born, are taken out of their family, which wouldn't even be a family anyway, because most people have many, many, many marriages. But they're taken away and sent to government-read schools their entire lives, so they're completely of the state, of this empire. This is the deterioration he sees. Even though they're technologically advanced, they are soulless. He has a couple meetings with the emperor, where he's able to discuss philosophy, and he acts as a prophet, saying, "Your hubris has brought you down, and you will be brought down by the Americans." At which point, soon thereafter, city of Boston, which is destroyed by new technology that Rogers came up with, combining several of the technologies that he saw once he got there, and then an attack on Lotan, which is the seat of the empire in America. It's their capital city. Start falling on Lotan from the Americans. They try to figure out what's going on, at which point they call them eyeballs, but are basically drones. Come in, fly up around. Some of them shoot out poisonous gas. Some of them have guns. Some of them have rays. Some of them just go and explode, these drones. They're able to find Buck Rogers, pull him into safety. The Emperor didn't think that Buck Rogers would ever escape, so he told him everything, gave him free range of walking around their city. So he knew all their weak points. He knew their plan for the future. So once he was escaped with 8 of these drones, he gets all this information and immediately goes and attacks. And they completely destroy Lotan, and the Emperor's plans for new underground cities are completely destroyed as well. And that's where the book ends, saying the other cities which the Hans have over the next few years are also destroyed. That's the plot. So what are the interesting ideas in this book? As I explained earlier, the Han Empire, although appearing strong on the outside, was brittle, and was brittle due to decadence. The end of chapter 11, he basically comes out and says it. Taken altogether, in short, the Han world of 2419 seems like a gloomy extrapolation of my own world as it had been headed where I had left. The Hans had made all the same major mistakes that the Americans of my time had made. Perhaps being conquered by the Hans was the only thing that had saved us Americans. So like I said before, jobs that didn't have any real meaning, everything coming super easy, not having to work for anything, no marriages, no family life existing. This world that looked so good from the outside, being so decadent. He doesn't use the word decadence, but that's basically what it is. Was the downfall of the Hans. And perhaps, like he says here, that's being put in a state below the Hans, being in the wild having to hide yourself, because if you made yourself known, the Hans would come and destroy you, was the only thing that kept the American spirit in there. Something else that's interesting is the race relations. So the Americans are shown as being white, and the Hans are Chinese. But not just that, but it's weird. It plays on all sorts of different things that you might expect or might not expect. So as we saw with the whole decadence idea, the Hans were not evil because they were Chinese, but because they were cruel and decadent. And the Americans were, one of the reasons that made them good was because they were able to care about the environment, live in the environment, know the environment, and have good and proper relations in themselves. While discussing the gangs, they were described almost socialistic. You owned only basically the things that were you could hold on your body at one time. You owned your clothes and some knickknacks, and that's basically it. Everything else was the gangs. You didn't work for money. You worked for prestige that then allowed you to get better positions in the gang. And you spent your whole life working for that, which is a strange thing to come out of 1920s America. If I hadn't known better, I also would sort of think, this was written in the 20s, and the version where there was put together and then updated came out in 1962. There's sort of Vietnam vibes in there too, of this outside force coming in and forcing their way of life. But in this case, the outside force is Chinese, and the people who are getting oppressed are the white Americans. There's also, in the epilogue, which I believe, from reading it, it feels like it's added on in just this version. I may be wrong. Basically, an explanation that we're not racist. We were fighting everyone against the tyranny that came from the Hans. When we were done fighting off the Hans in America, we helped, we helped the noble brown-skinned Caucasians of India, the sturdy Balkanites of southern Europe, and the wise and spiritual blacks of Africa. This charity and gentleness did not fail even in our context with the non-Han Mongolians of Japan and the coast province of China. And then there's a theory going on that they're saying, and we think that the Hans weren't actually human, that they were aliens had crashed into Earth, into China, and then had taken over Tibet and mated with Tibetans, which gave them the look of humans, but the fact that they were soulless meant that they weren't. It is definitely not something I don't think that could be published today, even though its take on it is not the take that you might expect. It's not a simple story or simple idea of race relations, and after being written, they then realized the issues with it, and it was then later fixed with this add-on saying they weren't human, which kind of almost makes it worse, actually, saying they weren't human, they just looked human, but were actually aliens. Something that we know from history is if you otherize people and you say they aren't human, that makes it easier to destroy, which I guess kinda is trying to make it acceptable, the destruction that they did of Hotan, because not only did they destroy it, but there is some description about these drones going through and just mowing down people, running into them, and killing them all, no matter who they were, because they were all of this empire of Han. So, Armageddon 2419 has some interesting themes about race and empire and decadence. And even though it's the seminal novel of Buck Rogers, I think it's probably best to go and read the other ones. It was definitely a little bit rough of a story. I read it and then I looked up what exactly it was, and I'm like, it sort of feels like there are two stories here. One where it's brought into the future and then an army sequence, and then the second one where he's captured and then is able to escape and destroy his captors. And it was two short stories pushed together. I'm glad I have it, I'm glad I read it, but unless you're someone who is trying to understand the Buck Rogers phenomena, it's probably unnecessary. If you're going to read Buck Rogers, I'd probably stick to the original 12 novels that came out and not the short story that preceded it. Similar to the previous short story collection, by Philip Jose Farmer. I couldn't read that short story because the short story was an idea for Riverworld, which was then turned into something different and deeper when it was made in a book series. This is sort of the outline of the idea, but I don't think this is what my father ever read to me, and I don't know that it's something that needs to be read, unless you are someone like me who wants to get into Buck Rogers. If you watched this video and you enjoyed it, give it a like and a thumbs up. Have you read Buck Rogers? Do you have any thoughts? Have you read the comic strip, or watched a movie, or another movie, or one of the multiple TV series that came out about it? Let me know. Alright, have fun.